began March 10th. We've been playing basically under our old contract since the season began in, I guess, mid-September. And basically they decided that there's some people left in the world that have a pension, and that's not the way they feel the world should be, is my take on it, because they're not actually saving all that much money with the defined contribution stuff they want to do with us. I think it's ideological.
There's so many differences between what we do and what, a business person might do. And so I don't really feel like you can compare our retirement benefits to someone who works at a bank. It's just a very different kind of job. The interview process, for one, is very different. I mean, most people who work in that sector get flown around if they want to apply for a job and by the company. For us, we're spending thousands of dollars every time we take an audition. I, for one, have taken close to 30 auditions before I won my CSO job. So I don't want to think about how much money I spent just to win my job. And this is supposed to be, the end-all be-all of jobs for me. So I intend to be here for 35 years, and I would like to retire with dignity.
And the other issue, we've always been one of the preeminent orchestras in the world, and the reason for that is, to some extent, because we always had this great contract. And people would come from other orchestras all over the country and even over the world to play with us. Our timpani player, Dave Herbert, amazing player, he came from San Francisco. We have players from New York, we have players from Boston, we have players from Philadelphia, Cleveland, you name it. And a lot of those orchestras, San Francisco, New York, Boston, I can't think of the other ones, still have very well funded, very secure defined benefit pensions. I try to imagine being on that stage and thinking, well, we played okay, Boston would have played a little better, San Francisco would have played a little better, but that's good enough for us. It's inconceivable. But that's our management's attitude. No, we can't quite manage to provide them what our counterparts in these other orchestras do, but we're fine with being second rate. And, it comes down to that.
I had this job in New Zealand before where most of the funding for the orchestras and for the arts come from the government. So it's a really different kind of system. But obviously in America, it's a different setup. We rely heavily on philanthropy, and we're extremely grateful for the people who give and the people who love music. I think historically our board has been made up of people who just really love the music, and so that's why they give money. I've heard that in recent years it's kind of turned to be more corporate, and there's less of a connection with the individuals on our board.
I think a lot of the trustees, the money is their lodestar. You see how they conduct business. You see them willing to hurt people and destroy families so they can have $3 billion instead of $2. I don't understand it. It's like I'm reading about some Aztec human sacrifice thing. It's just, how can people do that? But clearly there's people on their side that are that way, and I think it's incomprehensible to them that there's people on our side, not just me, but all the veterans are saying, yes, it's good for us, but it's not good for the orchestra. It's not good for our colleagues. It's not good for the people that aren't in the orchestra yet. And it's not what we envision the Chicago Symphony to be. And so even though it's not in our financial interest, you've got to have something in your life that's more important than your net worth, Mm-hmm.
I joined 2 years ago in 2017. I grew up in Chicago in Hyde Park, and I moved all around. The orchestra job I had prior to this was in New Zealand, in Auckland, which was really great. But there was an opening in the CSO, and my predecessor had been in the orchestra for, I think, around 40 years. So these openings don't happen very often. You have to wait for someone to retire or maybe change careers, or in the worst case scenario, even die for a job to open up. So there was an opening and I went for it, and it was honestly one of the best days of my life when I won that job.
I was a freelancer in New York, and I realized that guys 10, 15 years older than me were not doing any better, were living in a life where, a family and a secure life was impossible. And I realized that if I wanted to have a life where I could have a secure, middle-class, dignified life, the institutions that were providing that were the major orchestras. And I looked around and I, thought Chicago sounded great, and I took a wild shot in the dark and I won the audition, and Georg Solti hired me. And until recently, I thought I had it made, A really telling thing was they have a new mission statement, which came out, we don't even know exactly when, but it came out within the last year or two. And for the first time in the history of the Chicago Symphony, the mission statement makes no mention that it's their job to maintain the quality of the orchestra, let alone make it a preeminent orchestra. There's no mention of that.
The fire that happened last week in Notre Dame, people came to aid of that situation instantly with billions of dollars. I mean, the money is out there. I think, I'm not saying that the CSO is a more or less worthy cause than that. I do think that's an important, cultural landmark. But I think it just proves that when people care about something, they'll open up their wallets.
I do think that there is a feeling that, yes, I have wealth and power, and I can bend the world to my will. And, it really started with Reagan. The idea that you have to pay taxes became this punishment. And yeah, we don't want to pay you any more than we have to. We can have a perfectly good orchestra for less money, and I got better things to do with my money than spend it on my community. I think it boils down to that. Certainly with some of them.
Both of my parents actually worked for Chicago Public Schools. They were teachers and administrators both. They both are retired now, and they both have pensions, which they are extremely grateful for. So I think I've seen how these labor disputes have affected my parents directly, and also how coming out of it with a better contract has made their lives better as well. So I feel like a kind of personal connection with teachers in that way. It's just not fair. Everyone should have access to a great education and great arts education. I think it's a connection with history and with the past. It's great art that we get to experience now. It's like going to see a Shakespeare play or going to see a really beautiful painting at a museum. There's just something about it that we all really connect with, which is why it's stood the test of all these hundreds of years in some cases. I think it's something that people can really connect with even if they don't have a musical education. It can really make them feel things that you can't really explain in words.
I love Sibelius, I love Mahler, I love Bartók. It depends who's conducting. If you have a Nordic conductor who really understands Sibelius, that's really cool. If you have some old Viennese guy who has this pipeline into Schubert and Mahler, it's, I guess I have no favorites. I guess there's a few composers I don't particularly like, but a whole lot I love.
One of my favorite composers would have to be Mahler. I don't know why, I just really connect with the lushness and the big sound that he gets from the whole orchestra. I love being surrounded by the whole instrument of the orchestra. So yeah, I've always liked being immersed in that sound rather than playing a solo. So I thought, playing in the section, which is my job, I'm second flute, really suits me. So yeah, any of the Mahler symphonies are some of my favorites. Also Debussy, Ravel, that French impressionistic music is really fun to play as well.
He was a force of nature. He was this kinetic force. It was kind of rock and roll, the rhythm was driving and relentless. And it was, in a way, easy because you just went. With Barenboim, it was more the rhythms of speech and more flexible. And it was a lot of adrenaline. Certain
composers who are long dead kind of wrote about a lot of these things. Mahler being one of them. Beethoven, definitely. Kind of just sticking it to the man. And I feel again, that music kind of still resonates today because it speaks to those issues. I don't think that we're directly necessarily doing anything, but I think just continuing to play music is putting good energy out into the world. That's how I like to think of it, at least.